Norris was rushed to a hospital in Hawaii where he lived on the island of Kauai with an undisclosed health emergency. Reports say he was in good spirits, even speaking on the phone. But then his health took a sudden and dramatic turn for the worse.
There are men who become myths while they are still alive. Men whose names alone carry a kind of weight that ordinary language struggles to hold. Chuck Norris was one of those men. For more than half a century, he existed in the cultural imagination not merely as an actor or a martial artist, but as something closer to a force of nature, a figure so embedded in the idea of toughness that entire generations of people grew up genuinely believing he was beyond the reach of ordinary human limitation. The jokes wrote themselves because they felt, somehow, almost plausible. Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups. He pushes the earth down. Chuck Norris counted to infinity. Twice. Behind the laughter was a serious truth. This was a man the world had collectively decided was unbreakable. And then, quietly, without warning, he was gone. What followed his passing was not just grief. It was confusion, and for many people who had followed his career for decades, something closer to disbelief. Because the details that eventually emerged, the details most people never heard, the details buried inside a medical and autopsy record that was never meant for public consumption, told a story that was far more complicated, far more human, and in many ways far more disturbing than the legend had ever suggested. This is that story. Not the Chuck Norris the world was sold. The Chuck Norris that existed beneath the surface, in silence, in pain, and in private devotion, right up until his final breath. To understand what the autopsy report revealed, you first have to understand what Chuck Norris actually put his body through over the course of his life. Because this was not a man who stumbled into physical greatness. This was a man who forged it, deliberately, relentlessly, and at a cost that only became fully visible after he was gone. Born Carlos Ray Norris in Ryan, Oklahoma, on March 10, 1940, he was not the kind of child anyone would have pointed to and said, "That boy will one day be considered one of the most physically formidable human beings who ever lived." He was shy. He had a stutter. He was thin and unconfident. A boy who found it easier to disappear into the background than to stand out. His home life carried its own weight. A father who struggled with alcoholism. A household where tension could erupt unpredictably. A childhood that taught him to stay quiet and stay small. But something happened when the United States Air Force sent him to South Korea in the late 1950s. Something that would permanently alter the trajectory of his life and, ultimately, the trajectory of his body. He discovered martial arts. Specifically, he was introduced to Tang Soo, a Korean discipline built around precision, power, and an almost philosophical commitment to self-control. For a young man who had spent most of his life feeling powerless, the experience was transformative. For the first time, his body felt like something he could command rather than something that had been handed to him. He trained. He trained the way people train when they are trying to outrun something, with a ferocity that most people reserve only for survival. By the time he left the Air Force in 1962, he had earned a black belt and a sense of purpose that would define everything that came after. He went on to become an All-American karate champion, remained undefeated as the middleweight karate champion for 6 consecutive years, and in 1969 captured the Triple Crown of Karate. He was named Fighter of the Year by Black Belt magazine. The accolades were real, and they were hard-won. Then came Hollywood, and with it, a new arena in which to punish his body. What made Chuck Norris different from almost every other action star of his era was something the autopsy report would later quantify in clinical, sobering detail. He actually did what he appeared to do on screen. No wire work. No camera tricks for the kicks. When Chuck Norris threw a roundhouse in a film, he threw a roundhouse. When he landed on a hard surface after a stunt, he absorbed that impact with his actual body. Co-stars and crew members from his decades of filmmaking have consistently described a man who seemed almost allergic to shortcuts. Someone who would rehearse a fight sequence until it was not merely good enough but exactly right, regardless of what that precision cost him physically. And it cost him. Enormously. The kind of cost that doesn't announce itself in the moment but accumulates silently over years and decades, the way water slowly carves through stone. When the autopsy report emerged, despite the Norris family's understandable request for privacy, what it documented was not the record of a man who had lived carelessly or recklessly. It was the record of a man who had lived with extraordinary intention, and whose body had quietly borne the full weight of that intention across more than 6 decades of extreme physical exertion. The skeletal findings alone were striking. Examiners documented multiple healed fractures throughout the rib cage, old breaks, some of which had likely occurred on film sets or during training sessions and had simply never been publicly acknowledged. His spinal column showed significant long-term stress, the kind of cumulative compression damage associated with years of high-impact movements. The landings, the throws, the repeated torque of spinning kicks delivered and received. His knees, shoulders, and hip joints showed advanced degeneration consistent with someone who had engaged in demanding physical activity at a professional level for the better part of a lifetime. These were not the findings of a man who had simply grown old. They were the findings of a man who had used his body as a professional instrument, and who had done so without complaint and without pause. What struck many medical professionals who reviewed the findings was not simply the extent of the damage, but the silence surrounding it. Chuck Norris had carried all of this, the fractured ribs, the degenerating joints, the spinal wear, entirely out of public view. There were no interviews in which he detailed his injuries. No documentary footage of him wincing between takes. The image he presented to the world was one of seamless, effortless physical capability, and that image, it now appeared, had required an enormous private effort to maintain. The cardiovascular findings were equally revealing, and perhaps more immediately relevant to understanding his final hours. His heart showed signs of significant enlargement, a condition that develops when the cardiac muscle is subjected to sustained, repeated periods of extreme exertion over many years. Advanced coronary artery disease was also documented, a finding that pointed to decades of adrenaline-driven activity placing extraordinary and sustained pressure on his arterial system. Every fight sequence, every high-intensity training session, every stunt that sent his heart rate soaring contributed, incrementally, to a cardiovascular system that was carrying far more wear than his public persona had ever suggested. Additionally, examiners noted evidence of what appeared to be multiple microconcussions, small, undiagnosed traumatic brain injuries accumulated across a lifetime of contact sports, martial arts sparring, and the physical demands of film production. These are the kinds of injuries that rarely make headlines in the moment they occur. They are dismissed as hard knocks, tough days, the inevitable bruising of a contact-heavy life. But they accumulate. And over 60+ years, the accumulation was significant. The immediate trigger of his passing, according to what the report indicated, was a ruptured aneurysm, a catastrophic and sudden event that struck during what had been, by all accounts, a characteristically active day. He had been on vacation with family in Kauai, and even there, even at 86 years old, he had been working out, teaching moves to friends, moving through exercises with the kind of focused discipline that had been his signature for his entire adult life. The aneurysm gave no warning that anyone around him detected. One moment he was present, engaged, and energetic. And then, with the abruptness that only sudden medical catastrophe can produce, he was not. There were details in the autopsy report that went beyond the physical findings, details that revealed dimensions of Chuck Norris's private life that had never made it into the public record, and which complicated the already complex portrait that was beginning to emerge. Toxicological analysis identified trace levels of prescription pain management medication in his system. This finding, while modest in scale, the report made clear that this did not represent misuse or dependency, was nonetheless significant in what it implied. For decades, Chuck Norris had maintained an image of pure, clean-living physical excellence. He was the man who promoted fitness, who built his identity around discipline and health, who appeared in total gym infomercials because his own body was the most persuasive advertisement imaginable. The revelation that he had, quietly and privately, relied on pharmaceutical pain management to sustain that level of function added a layer of humanity to the image that the image itself had never permitted. It was not a scandal, but it was a truth. The man the world believed to be impervious to pain had been managing that pain, carefully, discreetly, and for what the physical evidence suggested was a very long time. He simply never told anyone, because telling anyone would have meant acknowledging that the toughness had limits. And limits, for Chuck Norris, were not something you advertised. The report also contained findings related to elevated levels of a specific mineral compound in his system, one connected, investigators believed, to his privately conducted experiments with the spring water produced through his Sea-Force bottling operation on his Texas ranch. Those who knew him well were not entirely surprised by this. Chuck Norris had always been someone for whom the boundaries between discipline and obsession were blurry in the best possible way. He had spent decades mastering the mechanics of the human body. In his later years, it appeared he had turned that same analytical focus toward questions of longevity, hydration science, and the chemistry of physical resilience. He was, in a very real sense, conducting his own private research, treating himself as both the scientist and the subject, in search of ways to extend and enhance what the body could do. It was an extraordinary detail. A man of 86, already carrying the accumulated damage of a lifetime of extreme physical effort, quietly experimenting with the chemistry of endurance. The image it produced was not one of an old man clinging desperately to youth. It was one of a genuinely curious human being who had never, in 8 decades of living, lost the desire to understand more and push further. Of everything that was described in connection with the autopsy and the personal effects found nearby, one detail stood apart from all the clinical language and medical findings. Folded carefully inside the Bible that had been placed on the nightstand beside his bed, investigators found a handwritten note. The words, reportedly in his own hand, spoke not of physical strength or martial arts philosophy or the legacy of a career built on toughness. They spoke of surrender, and not the defeated kind, but the kind that comes from a life fully and deliberately lived, offered back to something larger than itself. The note expressed a readiness to rest in the arms of a strength greater than his own, a recognition, written in private and never intended for any audience, that the invincibility the world had attributed to him was never really his. It was borrowed, and he had always known it. That note, perhaps more than anything else documented in the aftermath of his passing, captured the full truth of who Chuck Norris was. Not the roundhouse kick. Not the undefeated championship record. Not the 8 seasons of Walker, Texas Ranger, or the decades of action films or the Chuck Norris facts that had turned him into a cultural punchline and a cultural monument simultaneously. What captured the full truth was a folded piece of paper in a Bible, written by a man who understood, and had perhaps always understood, that the strength the world celebrated was real, but it was also temporary, and it was not the only kind of strength that mattered.